This is Relaxing Asian History, a calm journey through Asia's past. Long before there were kingdoms, long before there were walls or cities or written words, there were people moving quietly through ancient forests, people sheltering in caves as monsoon rains fell, people watching the slow turn of seasons along rivers that have flowed for millions of years. The story of Myanmar begins not with kings or chronicles, but with these silent millennia, with the patient work of hands shaping stone, with footprints left in places we can only imagine now. 60,000 years ago, a span of time almost impossible to hold in the mind, early humans were already here. They moved through landscapes that would one day be called the Irrawaddy Basin, the Salween Valley, the Central Dry Zone. But these names did not exist yet. There were only the land itself, the rivers, the endless green of forests, and the people who knew them intimately. These early communities left behind stone tools, simple at first glance perhaps, but each one a small miracle of human ingenuity. A flake of stone struck just so, an edge sharp enough to cut, a scraper to prepare hides. Each tool represents hours of careful work, knowledge passed from one generation to the next, and a deep understanding of the materials the earth provided. They were hunter-gatherers, these ancient peoples. They followed game through the forests. They gathered roots, fruits, seeds. They knew which plants would nourish and which would harm. They read the landscape like we might read a book. Every rock formation, every bend in a river, every animal track telling them something essential about survival. As the millennia unfolded, some of these people made their homes in caves, limestone caves worn smooth by water and time, scattered across what is now central and eastern Myanmar. Inside these shelters, protected from rain and sun, families gathered, fires were lit, stories were told, children learned the ways of their elders, and on the walls of some of these caves, something remarkable happened. Someone, and we will never know their name, took red ochre, a natural pigment drawn from the earth, and began to paint a human figure, an animal, the outline of a hand pressed against stone, fingers splayed, geometric shapes whose meaning has dissolved into the depths of time. These are among the earliest expressions of the human imagination in this land. They are not mere decoration. They speak of something deeper, a need to mark one's presence, to communicate across time, to connect the visible world with something unseen. Perhaps they were part of rituals. Perhaps they told stories of hunts or spirits. Perhaps they marked sacred spaces where the boundary between the everyday and the supernatural grew thin. We cannot know for certain, but we can stand before them now, tens of thousands of years later, and feel the presence of those ancient artists. We can recognize in their work the same human impulse that moves through all of us, the desire to leave something behind, to say, I was here, I saw these things, I felt this world around me. The archaeological record shows us a long, unbroken tradition. Thousands upon thousands of stone tools have been found, choppers and scrapers, adzes and hand axes, each one fashioned with skill, each one a link in a chain of knowledge, stretching back through countless generations. There were other traces, too, bone fragments from the animals they hunted, charcoal from their fires, still dark after all these millennia. Pigments ground from minerals, ready to color skin or objects or cave walls. These humble remains are precious now. They let us glimpse lives lived in rhythms we have largely forgotten. Rhythms tied to season and weather, to the movements of animals, to the ripening of wild foods. This way of life continued for an almost incomprehensible length of time, tens of thousands of years during which change came slowly, imperceptibly, measured not in years or even centuries, but in millennia. But change did come, gradually, so gradually that no single generation would have noticed. These communities began to shift their way of life. The transition was subtle at first. Perhaps people began to return to certain favorable places, season after season. Perhaps they began to encourage the growth of useful plants. Perhaps they noticed that seeds dropped near camp would sprout the following year. This was the beginning of agriculture, not a sudden revolution, but a slow transformation. Groundstone tools began to appear alongside the chipped stone implements of earlier times. These polished tools, axes and adzes smoothed by hours of grinding, were better suited to clearing land, to working wood, to the demands of a more settled existence. This Neolithic transition, as archaeologists call it, was part of a broader pattern across Southeast Asia. Everywhere, in different places and at different paces, human communities were discovering that they could shape their environment more deliberately, that they could cultivate rather than simply gather, that they could stay in one place rather than constantly move. Myanmar's prehistoric peoples were part of this ancient, worldwide transformation of human life. By approximately 4,000 years ago, another profound change was underway. Communities in Myanmar had learned to work with bronze, that golden-colored alloy of copper and tin that marks a threshold in human technology. Bronze tools have been found, bronze ornaments, bronze objects placed carefully in graves. Each piece represents not just technical knowledge, but social complexity. Bronze working requires mining, smelting, casting. It requires trade networks to bring together copper and tin, which rarely occur in the same place. It requires specialists, craftspeople who devoted their lives to mastering this technology. These Bronze Age communities were not isolated. They were connected through vast exchange networks that stretched across the region. Goods moved along rivers and overland routes. Ideas traveled with them. Techniques were shared. Styles and symbols crossed from one group to another. Myanmar, even in these early times, was never an island unto itself. It was always part of a larger world, connected to distant places through the patient movement of traders, travelers, and ideas. Iron came later, perhaps around 3,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries. The dating of these ancient transitions is never precise. It varies from place to place, and the evidence is fragmentary. Iron did not immediately replace bronze. For a long time, both technologies existed side by side, but iron had advantages. Iron ore was more abundant. Iron tools could be harder, sharper, more durable. An iron axe could clear forest more efficiently. An iron blade could shape wood with greater precision. With iron came larger settlements. Villages grew into small towns, especially in the central regions along the great Irrawaddy River. Population increased. Social structures became more complex. Leaders emerged. Differences in wealth and status became more pronounced. Rice, that grain that would become the foundation of so many Southeast Asian civilizations, was now being cultivated on a significant scale. Fields were prepared, water was managed, harvests were stored. The rhythms of life began to revolve around the agricultural calendar. The planting, the growing season, the harvest, the period of rest. With reliable food supplies came the possibility of specialization. Not everyone needed to farm. Some could devote themselves to craft work, to trade, to religious practices, to leadership. Trade routes expanded and strengthened. Connections reached toward what we now call China, toward the coastal regions, toward the cultures emerging in Thailand and beyond. Glass beads, carnelian stones, pottery styles, bronze objects, all these moved along these ancient highways, changing hands, carrying with them the imprint of distant places. The dead, during these Iron Age centuries, were buried with care. Pottery vessels were placed in graves, bronze ornaments, decorative items of various kinds. These grave goods tell us something important. There were differences in how people were buried. Some graves contain many objects, others contain few or none. This suggests social hierarchy. Some individuals, whether through birth, achievement, or role in society, were afforded more elaborate burial rites. The community's resources were invested in honoring them, in ensuring they were equipped for whatever journey lay beyond death. The burial customs themselves show influences from far away. Scholars can trace connections to practices in what is now India, Thailand, southern China. Cultural influences flowed along those same trade routes that carried physical goods, ideas about the afterlife, about proper treatment of the dead, about the relationship between the living and the ancestral world. All these could travel as readily as bronze or beads. Among the prehistoric traditions of Myanmar, one stands out for the richness of its archaeological remains. This is what archaeologists call the Anyathian culture, named after a Burmese word for the upper Irrawaddy region. The Anyathian peoples lived primarily along the river terraces of the Irrawaddy Basin, those elevated plateaus above the floodplain where settlements could be safe from the river's annual rise. They produced a remarkable variety of stone tools: choppers for heavy work, scrapers for preparing hides, adzes for woodworking, hand axes for multiple purposes. Even though they lived in fertile river valleys where agriculture would eventually flourish, the Anyathian peoples remained primarily hunters and gatherers. They maintained the ancient lifeway, the skills and knowledge that had sustained humans in this region for tens of thousands of years. Their sites, scattered along the river, speak of a people deeply adapted to their environment, moving with the seasons, following the resources the land and water provided. All of these prehistoric and early cultural phases, the cave dwellers with their ochre paintings, the Bronze Age metal workers, the Iron Age villagers cultivating rice, all of them laid foundations. They established the pathways that would later become major trade routes. They developed the agricultural practices that would feed later kingdoms. They created social patterns, hierarchies, ritual practices, relationships with the land that would echo forward through time. When the Pew people arrived, speaking languages related to Burmese and other Tibeto-Burman tongues, when they began building their walled city-states in the fertile Irrawaddy Valley, they were not starting from nothing. They inherited landscapes already shaped by millennia of human presence. They inherited knowledge, where to plant, how to work metal, where sacred places were. Many practices that we associate with later Buddhist Burma, the use of caves as sacred spaces, the creation of ritual pathways, the symbolic importance of certain animals, these have roots reaching back into these prehistoric times, back to animist beliefs and spiritual practices that long predated the arrival of Buddhism or any organized religion. So the story of Myanmar begins in silence and shadow. It begins with unnamed peoples leaving traces we can barely read. It begins with patience, the slow accumulation of knowledge over vast stretches of time. It begins with hands shaping stone, with fires in caves, with red pigment on rock walls, with the first tentative experiments in planting seeds and tending crops. These were not primitive peoples in any meaningful sense. They were fully human, as intelligent and creative as we are, solving the problems of their world with ingenuity and persistence. They loved, grieved, wondered, created. They raised children and told stories. They looked up at the same stars we see, though they called them by different names, or perhaps by no names at all. Their legacy is everywhere in Myanmar, though invisible to casual eyes. It is in the rice fields and river valleys they first cultivated. It is in the cave shrines that would later become Buddhist pilgrimage sites. It is in the very bones of the culture that would emerge in later centuries. Before there were kingdoms, there was this, the long human apprenticeship to the land, the patient work of countless generations building the foundations of civilization, one stone tool, one planted seed, one painted image at a time. There is a place in central Myanmar where the earth seems to hold its breath. A vast plain stretches along the eastern bank of the Irrawaddy River, dusty and dry for much of the year, shimmering with heat. And across this plain, as far as the eye can see, rise temples. Hundreds of temples, thousands of temples, brick and stucco towers reaching toward the sky, their shapes softened by centuries, their surfaces golden in the slanting light of dawn and dusk. This is Bagan, the spiritual heart of Burma, the place where, between the 9th and 13th centuries, a kingdom arose that would shape the identity of Myanmar forever. The story of Pagan begins with migration and settlement. In the 9th century, a people called the Burmans, or Myanmar in their own language, moved into the fertile valley of the Irrawaddy River. They were not the first people here. The Pew, those Bronze and Iron Age peoples we might recall from earlier times, had already established city-states in this region. The valley was familiar with civilization, with trade, with the rhythms of irrigated agriculture. But the Burmans brought their own language, their own customs, their own vision of how society should be organized. And around the year 849, they fortified a settlement that would become known as Bagan. At first, it was one city among several. The Pew still held power in neighboring centers. The landscape was a patchwork of different peoples, different traditions, different loyalties. There was no unified state, no single authority commanding the entire river valley. But Bagan grew, its walls strengthened, its influence spread, and within 2 centuries it would become the capital of the first empire to truly unite the lands that we now call Myanmar. The transformation of Bagan from regional center to great empire is inseparable from one man, King Anarata, who ruled from 1044 to 1077. Before Anarata, Bagan was important but not dominant. Under Anarata, it became the political and spiritual center of a vast realm, stretching from the northern hills to the southern coast, from the valleys of the interior to the ports that connected Burma to the wider world of maritime trade. How did he accomplish this? Through military strength, certainly, through strategic alliances and calculated conquests, through the ability to project power along the great river that was the kingdom's central artery and lifeline. But Anarata's most enduring legacy was not military, it was spiritual. Buddhism had existed in the region for centuries, arriving along the same trade routes that carried goods and ideas from India and Sri Lanka. But it had taken many forms, mingled with local beliefs, adapted to local customs. Different schools of Buddhist thought competed and coexisted. Different practices and texts held sway in different places. Anarata made a choice that would echo through the centuries. He adopted and actively promoted Theravada Buddhism, specifically the traditions of the Mahavihara school of Sri Lanka, considered by its adherents to preserve the most authentic teachings of the Buddha. This was not merely a personal religious decision. It was a tool of state building, a way of creating cultural unity across diverse populations. By establishing Theravada Buddhism as the kingdom's primary religious identity, Anarata gave his realm a shared spiritual vocabulary, a common framework of meaning and value. Monks trained in the Theravada tradition became advisors to the court, educators of the elite, moral authorities whose influence extended into every corner of the kingdom. Monasteries became centers of learning. Buddhist concepts of righteous kingship, the idea that a ruler should be a dharmaraja, a king who governs according to Buddhist principles, shaped political ideology. Pagan was becoming not just a kingdom, but a Buddhist kingdom, not just an empire, but a sacred landscape. And what a landscape it became. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, across those 200 years of Pagan's dominance, the rulers and wealthy elites of the kingdom engaged in an extraordinary act of collective creation. They built temples, thousands upon thousands of temples. The numbers are staggering. More than 10,000 Buddhist monuments, temples, pagodas, monasteries were constructed on the Bagan plain during this period. 10,000, each one representing enormous investment of resources, labor, devotion, each one a physical manifestation of faith, a statement in brick and stone about what mattered most to the people who built them. Today, roughly 2,000 to 2,200 of these structures still stand. Time, earthquakes, the simple erosion of centuries, all have taken their toll. But even this fraction of the original total is breathtaking. To stand on the Bagan plain and see temple after temple stretching to the horizon is to witness one of the great architectural achievements of human civilization. Why did they build so much? What drove this extraordinary outpouring of religious construction? Part of the answer lies in Buddhist concepts of merit-making. In Theravada Buddhism, one accumulates spiritual merit through good deeds, through acts of generosity, through moral behavior, through supporting the Sangha, the community of monks. And one of the most powerful ways to generate merit was to sponsor the construction of religious monuments. A temple was more than a building. It was a gift to the Buddha, to the Dharma, to all sentient beings. It was an act that would generate merit not just for the donor, but for their family, their descendants, perhaps for countless rebirths to come. To build a temple was to invest in one's spiritual future, to create something that would continue generating merit long after one's death. Kings built temples to demonstrate their piety and legitimize their rule. Queens and royal consorts built temples to secure their own spiritual welfare and establish their own legacy. Officials and wealthy merchants built temples to display their status and earn religious merit. Even ordinary people, pooling their resources, could sponsor smaller shrines and stupas. The result was a landscape transformed into a vast three-dimensional mandala, a sacred geography where the boundary between the human and divine realms seemed thin, where every turn of the eye encountered a reminder of the Buddha's teachings. But the kingdom's prosperity rested on more earthly foundations as well. The Irrawaddy Valley, for all its spiritual significance, was valued first and foremost for its agricultural productivity. The central regions where Bagan arose were semi-arid, receiving limited rainfall, but the Irrawaddy itself carried life. Its waters, properly managed, could transform dry land into fertile rice fields, and so the kingdom invested heavily in irrigation. Large reservoirs were constructed to capture and store water. Canals were dug to carry it to the fields. The technology was not particularly sophisticated by modern standards, but it was effective. The semi-arid zone around Bagan became highly productive agricultural land capable of supporting a large population and generating the surplus wealth that funded temples, armies, and courtly splendor. Rice was the foundation of everything. Rice fed the farmers who worked the land, the monks who depended on lay donations, the officials who administered the provinces, the soldiers who defended the borders. Without reliable rice production, none of the kingdom's achievements would have been possible. The agricultural surplus was systematically organized to support the kingdom's religious institutions. Wealthy donors, royalty, high officials, prosperous lay people would grant entire tracts of land to the Buddhist Sangha. These grants came with the cultivators who worked the land, families who became hereditary servants of the monastery or temple, their labor obligations passing from generation to generation. Crucially, these donated lands were tax-exempt. The revenues they generated went entirely to supporting the religious institution rather than the royal treasury. This arrangement had both positive and negative consequences. Initially, it stimulated growth. The Sangha, with guaranteed income from donated lands, could sponsor new settlements, bring marginal land under cultivation, support larger monastic communities. Economic activity expanded. New villages appeared. The kingdom's productive base broadened. But over time, the system became unsustainable. By the late 12th and 13th centuries, an enormous portion of the kingdom's most productive agricultural land had been granted away as tax-exempt religious property. The royal treasury's income stagnated even as expenses, military costs, administrative overhead, court expenditures continued to grow. The very generosity that expressed Pagan's deep Buddhist devotion was, ironically, undermining the kingdom's fiscal foundations. This tension between religious merit-making and political stability would ultimately play a role in Pagan's decline. As the kingdom expanded and consolidated, the cultural landscape of Upper Myanmar was being transformed. The Burmese language, the language of the Myanmar people, the language of the Pagan court, gradually became dominant across the central Irrawaddy Valley. Royal inscriptions were written in Burmese. Legal documents used Burmese. Religious texts were translated into Burmese. The rhythms and vocabulary of the language shaped how people thought, how they expressed themselves, how they understood the world. Other languages and identities did not disappear overnight. The Mon people of Lower Myanmar maintained their distinct culture. Various hill peoples continued their own traditions. The Irrawaddy Valley had always been ethnically diverse, and it remained so. But the Pew, those ancient inhabitants who had dominated the region before the Burmans arrived, gradually faded as a distinct people. Some may have migrated, many simply assimilated, adopting Burmese language and customs, marrying into Burman families, becoming part of the expanding Burman ethnic identity. By the early 13th century, the Pew as a separate group had largely ceased to exist, absorbed into the culture of their former neighbors. This process of cultural consolidation was not unique to Pagan. It happens whenever a strong state emerges, local identities soften, regional differences blur, a shared culture develops around the language and customs of the political center. Pagan was creating not just an empire, but a people, the Burmese people, whose identity would endure long after the kingdom itself had fallen. The kingdom's administration evolved to manage this expanding realm. Pagan was organized according to what scholars call a mandala pattern, a political model common in Southeast Asia, where power radiated outward from a central court in concentric circles of diminishing authority. At the center was the core region, the PYI, the country directly controlled by the king. This was the Irrawaddy Valley heartland, administered by royal governors, its resources directly accessible to the court. Beyond this lay the Tang, provinces that owed allegiance to Pagan but maintained considerable autonomy under their own local rulers. These provinces paid tribute, provided military support when required, acknowledged the king's supremacy, but their day-to-day governance remained largely in local hands, and beyond the provinces were the Naingangan, vassal states on the periphery of Pagan's influence. These were even more autonomous, their connection to Pagan consisting mainly of periodic tribute payments and nominal recognition of the king's overlordship. This system was flexible and pragmatic. It allowed Pagan to project influence over a vast territory without needing to directly administer every village and valley. Local rulers found it advantageous to acknowledge pagan supremacy in exchange for legitimacy and protection, and the kingdom extracted resources and loyalty without bearing the full costs of conquest and occupation. Over time, however, the system evolved. In strategically important regions, Lower Myanmar, with its access to maritime trade, the Tenasserim coast with its ports, the northern Irrawaddy areas that controlled routes to China, the pagan court gradually replaced hereditary local rulers with appointed governors answerable directly to the king. This reflected the kingdom's growing strength and sophistication. Where once it had been content with nominal allegiance, it now sought direct control. Where once it had ruled through negotiation with local power holders, it now imposed its own administrators. The kingdom was becoming more centralized, more bureaucratic, more systematic in its extraction of resources and enforcement of authority. At the heart of this system stood the royal court itself. The court of Pagan was simultaneously executive, legislature, and judiciary. All threads of power ran through it. All major decisions originated there. It was staffed by members of the royal family, by ministers drawn from cadet branches of the dynasty, by high officials rewarded with titles, land grants, and elaborate insignia that proclaim their rank and proximity to royal power. The court was not just a governing institution, it was a social world, an arena of competition and alliance, a stage where ambitions played out and fortunes rose and fell. To have access to the king was to have influence. To hold office at court was to control resources and shape policy. The politics of Pagan, like the politics of courts everywhere, was intensely personal, driven by kinship ties, patron-client relationships, and the endless maneuvering for advantage. Over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries, this courtly system became more formalized. A body known as the Hluttaw, a privy council of senior ministers and advisers, emerged to handle many of the daily functions of government. The Hluttaw would become a permanent feature of later Burmese kingdoms, an institutional innovation that outlasted Pagan itself. Law, too, became more systematic during the Pagan period. King Sithu I, who ruled from 1112 to 1167 and is sometimes called Alaung Sithu, issued one of the earliest recorded collections of Burmese law, known as the Alaung Sithu Hapiat Hei Ton. It was essentially a compilation of the king's own judgments, specific cases he had decided, which were then recorded and used as precedents for future disputes. This approach to law, building up a body of precedents through royal decisions, became characteristic of Burmese legal tradition. Law was not primarily a matter of abstract principles or comprehensive codes, but of accumulated wisdom derived from specific cases and the judgments of respected authorities. Later, under King Sithu II, Narapati Sithu, who reigned from 1174 to 1211, a Mon monk named Dhammavilasa compiled a second major collection of legal precedents. This further systematized civil and criminal justice in the kingdom, providing judges and officials with a reference work they could consult when rendering decisions. These legal compilations tell us something important about Pagan. It was not a realm where royal will alone determined justice. There were established procedures, recorded precedents, a sense that law should be consistent and predictable. This was a sophisticated state with complex mechanisms for maintaining social order. Pagan society itself was highly stratified, organized in clear hierarchies that everyone understood and generally accepted as the natural order of things. At the very top stood the royal family and the small circle of the highest ministers and court officials. These were the people who controlled vast estates, commanded armies, made decisions that affected millions of lives. Below them was a broader group of landholding officials, military officers, and wealthy merchants. These were people of substance and influence in their own communities, even if they lacked direct access to royal power. The Sangha, the Buddhist monastic community, occupied a unique position. Monks held no formal political office, but their moral authority was immense. Major monasteries controlled extensive landholdings and dependent populations. Senior abbots advised kings, mediated disputes, shaped public opinion. The Sangha was, in effect, a parallel hierarchy existing alongside the secular power structure. Below these elite groups were the common cultivators, the vast majority of the population. These were the people who actually worked the land, who grew the rice that fed everyone else. Their lives were constrained by obligations to their landlords, whether secular or religious. Many were tied to specific plots of land, their labor obligations heritable, their freedom of movement limited. And at the bottom were various dependent and servile groups, people obligated to perform specific services for the court or temples, hereditary servants, war captives, debtors, those who for various reasons had lost their freedom and autonomy. This was not an egalitarian society. Hierarchy was built into its very structure, justified by both Buddhist notions of karma. Your station in life reflected actions in past lives and practical considerations of power and control. Yet for all its stratification, pagan society produced remarkable artistic achievements, and we can still see them today in the murals that adorn many of Bagan's temples. More than 300 surviving monuments still contain mural paintings. Some are fragmentary, damaged by time and weather. Others remain remarkably vivid, their colors still strong after 7 or 8 centuries. These murals tell stories. Many depict Jataka tales, stories of the Buddha's previous lives, each illustrating a particular virtue or teaching. The Buddha appears as a wise king, a generous merchant, a self-sacrificing animal. These tales were enormously popular, familiar to everyone regardless of education or status, and the murals made them accessible even to those who could not read. Other murals show scenes from the Buddha's life, his birth, his enlightenment, his first sermon, his death, and passage into final nirvana. These were the sacred moments around which the Buddhist calendar revolved, depicted with care and devotion by artists who were themselves deeply immersed in the tradition. But the murals also show us secular life. Donors appear, depicted kneeling in reverence. We see how they dressed, what ornaments they wore, how they arranged their hair. We see architectural details of the period, the style of buildings, the construction of furniture, the tools and equipment of daily life. We see soldiers and farmers, dancers and musicians, merchants and servants. These images are precious evidence. They let us glimpse the visual culture of Pagan, the aesthetic preferences of its people, the things they valued and wanted to remember. The artistic style that emerged in Bagan's murals established patterns that would influence Burmese art for centuries. One characteristic feature is the combined use of human figures and kanak, elaborate floral scrollwork depicting lotus stems, buds, and blossoms. These decorative elements, borrowed from Indian artistic traditions but adapted to local tastes, frame narrative scenes and fill empty spaces with organic, flowing patterns. The color palette is distinctive: strong greens, pure whites, earth tones of red and ochre. These colors, derived from natural pigments, have aged differently, some fading, others intensifying. But enough remains to show us what the artists intended. There is a flatness to the style, a lack of three-dimensional perspective that modern Western viewers might initially find naive. But this is not a failure of skill. It reflects different artistic priorities, clarity of narrative, symbolic significance of gesture and position, decorative richness of surface. The murals were not meant to create illusions of reality, but to convey spiritual truths and tell sacred stories in ways immediately comprehensible to viewers. Looking at these murals today, we can feel the devotion that inspired them, the patient labor of artists working in dim temple interiors, the desire to create something beautiful as an offering to the Buddha and a gift to future generations. For 2.5 centuries, Pagan dominated the Irrawaddy Valley and much of what would become Myanmar. It was the first truly unified Burmese state, the creator of a cultural identity that persists to this day, the sponsor of artistic and architectural achievements that still inspire wonder. But no kingdom lasts forever. The 13th century brought new pressures. To the north, the Mongol Yuan Empire was expanding across Asia with terrifying speed and efficiency. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols had conquered China, Central Asia, much of the Middle East. They were the most formidable military power the world had seen in centuries, perhaps ever, and they turned their attention toward Southeast Asia. In the 1270s and 1280s, Mongol forces began probing south from their base in Yunnan, the region immediately north of Burma. They sent envoys demanding submission. They requested or demanded tribute. They made clear that they expected the kingdoms of the region to acknowledge Mongol supremacy. Pagan's response was ambiguous. King Narathihappate, who ruled during this crisis, faced an impossible situation. To refuse the Mongols risked invasion by an enemy that had destroyed kingdoms far more powerful than Pagan. To submit was to admit weakness, to compromise the very sovereignty that defined what it meant to be a king. The crisis came to a head in 1287. The exact details are debated by historians. Sources are fragmentary, sometimes contradictory, and chroniclers often embellished events for dramatic effect. But what seems clear is that Mongol forces pushed into Pagan territory, perhaps all the way to the capital itself, in what later tradition called the Battle of Pagan. Narathihappate ultimately acknowledged Yuan suzerainty. He agreed to pay tribute. In the Mongol understanding, Pagan had become a vassal state, subordinate to the Great Khan. But this submission could not save the king. Narathihatate was assassinated shortly after, whether by disgruntled officials who blamed him for the humiliation, by rival claimants to the throne, or through some other palace intrigue, we cannot say with certainty. With the king's death, the kingdom fragmented. The Mongols did not establish direct rule over central Myanmar. They lacked the resources and interest to administer such a distant territory. They were content with nominal submission and periodic tribute. But without that submission being enforced by a strong king, it became meaningless. Regional powers asserted independence. Shan chiefs in the north expanded their influence. Mon rulers in the south revived their own political ambitions. The governors and officials who had once answered to Pagan began acting as autonomous rulers of their own territories. The system of tax-exempt religious landholdings that had gradually weakened the royal treasury now revealed its full cost. The king lacked the revenues to maintain effective military forces or reward loyal officials. The fiscal foundation of the state had eroded beyond repair. By 1297, though the exact date is uncertain and may vary depending on how one defines the kingdom's end, Pagan as a unified state had ceased to exist. The great capital on the Irrawaddy Plain, with its thousands of temples, remained inhabited and continued as a religious center. But it was no longer the heart of an empire. It was merely one city among many in a landscape returning to political fragmentation. The first unified Burmese empire had fallen. Yet Pagan's legacy endured. The temples remained, silent witnesses to vanished glory. The Buddhist traditions it had nurtured continued to shape Burmese spiritual life. The Burmese language and cultural identity it had fostered persisted and eventually reasserted themselves when new kingdoms arose. Later dynasties would look back to Pagan as a golden age, a time when Burma had been united, powerful, and deeply devoted to the Dharma. Kings would claim descent from Pagan's royal line, or at least emulate its example. The very idea of what it meant to be a Burmese kingdom, the relationship between king and Sangha, the importance of merit-making through temple construction, the use of Theravada Buddhism as a source of political legitimacy, all this was Pagan's gift to the future. Standing today among the temples of Bagan, watching the sun set over the Irrawaddy, one can still feel the presence of that vanished kingdom. The silence of the plain is filled with memory. Every temple is a prayer in stone, every pagoda a gesture toward enlightenment, every brick a small act of devotion multiplied thousands of times over. Pagan fell as all kingdoms fall, but what it created in architecture, in art, in religious institutions, in cultural identity remains. It is the spiritual heart of Burma, beating still across the centuries. And from its ruins, eventually, new kingdoms would emerge. When a great tree falls in the forest, light suddenly floods the ground where there was once only shade. Seedlings that had waited in shadow surge upward, competing for space and sun. The forest does not remain empty. It transforms, becoming something different, more chaotic, less unified than before. So it was with Pagan's fall. The temples remained on the plain at Bagan, silent witnesses to vanished glory, but the political unity they represented, that first great Burmese empire, had shattered. The Mongol incursions of 1287, the assassination of King Narathihabate, the collapse of central authority, all these scattered what Pagan had held together. The story did not end. It fractured into many stories, each unfolding in different parts of what had once been a single realm. For the next 2.5 centuries, Myanmar would be a land of competing kingdoms, shifting alliances, persistent warfare, and cultural fluorescence in multiple centers. It was a time of fragmentation, yes, but also a time of remarkable vitality, as different regions developed their own political identities and cultural expressions. For the next 2.5 centuries, Myanmar would be a land of competing kingdoms, shifting alliances, persistent warfare, and cultural fluorescence in multiple centers. It was a time of fragmentation, but also a time of remarkable vitality, as different regions developed their own political identities and cultural expressions. In the immediate aftermath of Pagan's fall, the central dry zone, that heartland along the Irrawaddy where Bagan itself stood, did not simply dissolve into anarchy. 3 military leaders emerged from the chaos. Their names were Athinkaya, Yazathinyan, and Thihathu, commanders who had served under Pagan but now saw opportunity in its weakness. In 1297, these 3 overthrew the last nominal Pagan king, a ruler named Kiauswa, who had been little more than a figurehead presiding over the ruins of empire. The 3 brothers, they may or may not have been actual siblings, but later tradition calls them the 3 Shan brothers, established a new center of power at Myanmar, in the dry zone north of Bagan. The Myanmar kingdom, as it came to be known, effectively controlled the central region, claiming to be the rightful successors to Pagan's authority. But the Mongols had not forgotten Myanmar. In the years 1300 and 1301, Mongol forces returned. They marched south from Yunnan and laid siege to Myanmar, determined to enforce the submission they believed was owed to the Great Khan. The siege might have ended in catastrophe for the defenders. The Mongols were experienced, well-equipped, accustomed to victory. But the walls held, and the rulers of Myanmar offered something the Mongol commanders found more attractive than continued fighting: a very large payment in gold, silver, and precious goods. The Mongols accepted. They lifted the siege and withdrew, and by 1303 they had completely pulled out of Upper Myanmar, never to return in force. Whatever ambitions the Yuan dynasty had harbored for direct control of this region, they abandoned them. The distance was too great, the terrain too difficult, the rewards too uncertain. Upper Myanmar was free to work out its own destiny without foreign interference. But unity proved elusive. The Myanmar polity, never particularly stable, soon split as its founders competed for supremacy. By 1315 to 1317, the central dry zone had divided into 2 rival Burmese kingdoms. In the north, centered on the city of Sagaing along the Irrawaddy, one kingdom arose. In the south, based at Pinya, another established itself. Both claimed legitimacy as inheritors of Pagan's legacy. Both sought to expand their influence. Both watched each other warily across a frontier that remained contested and unstable. This division would persist for nearly half a century. Two Burmese kingdoms, where once there had been one empire, neither strong enough to dominate the other, neither willing to acknowledge the other's superiority. And to complicate matters further, new powers were rising in the hills to the north and east. The Shan people, Thai-speaking groups who had long inhabited the upland regions, were organizing into powerful states and chiefdoms. The most formidable of these was centered at Ma, also known as Mong Mao, in what is now the borderlands between Myanmar and China. Throughout the 14th century, Shan forces repeatedly raided into the Irrawaddy Valley. These were not mere border skirmishes. They were devastating campaigns that burned villages, seized livestock and people, disrupted agriculture, and slowly bled the central Burmese kingdoms of their strength. Pinya, in particular, suffered terribly. Its countryside was ravaged, its population declined, its ability to maintain effective military forces and administrative control gradually eroded under the relentless pressure of Shan raids. In 1364, the inevitable happened. Shan forces from Ma swept down into the valley and sacked both Saging and Pinya. The two rival capitals, weakened by decades of mutual warfare and external raiding, could not withstand the assault. The sacking of these cities might have meant the end of Burmese power in Upper Myanmar. But from the ruins, a new leader emerged. His name was Thado Minbya. He was a Shan himself by some accounts, or at least someone who had risen to prominence in the mixed Shan-Burman political world of the time. What mattered was not his ethnic background, but his ability to seize opportunity. Thado Minbya took control of the devastated capitals and in 1365 founded a new kingdom centered on the city of Ava, also known as Inwa, strategically positioned at the confluence of the Irrawaddy and Mi'itge rivers. Ava would become the dominant power in Upper Myanmar for the next century and a half. It was a Burmese kingdom in language and culture, even though Shan influence remained strong, particularly in military affairs. Many of Ava's soldiers were Shan. Many of its nobles had Shan connections. The boundaries between ethnic categories remained fluid, porous, negotiable. What mattered to Ava's rulers was controlling the central dry zone, maintaining the irrigation systems that fed its rice-producing capacity, and asserting authority over the trade routes that connected the interior to the outside world. But while these dramas played out in Upper Myanmar, an entirely different kingdom was consolidating in the south. Lower Myanmar, the delta region and coastal plains near the Gulf of Martaban, had always been somewhat distinct from the interior. The climate was wetter, the soil richer, Mon-speaking peoples predominated. Cultural influences came as much from maritime Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean world as from the interior highlands. After Pagan's collapse, this region coalesced into a kingdom of its own. Known as Hanthawaddy, or by its Sanskrit-derived name Ramanadesa, this Mon kingdom initially centered on the port city of Martaban before later shifting its capital to Pegu, Bago, in modern Myanmar. Hanthawaddy emerged in the late 13th century and would persist as an independent kingdom for more than 200 years into the early 16th century. It was never simply a lesser version of the Burmese kingdoms of the interior. It had its own identity, its own institutions, its own vision of political order. And in the early 15th century, it produced one of the most formidable rulers of the entire post-Pagan period. King Razadarit ruled Hanthawaddy from 1384 to 1421. Under his leadership, the Mon kingdom unified all of Lower Myanmar under a single authority for the first time since Pagan's fall. Villages became towns, towns became cities, trade flourished. Buddhist monasteries were endowed with lands and patronage. The kingdom grew wealthy on control of maritime commerce flowing through its ports. But Razadarit is remembered primarily for war. For 40 years, from roughly 1385 to 1424, Hanthawaddy and Ava fought what came to be known as the 40 Years' War. It was not continuous fighting. There were truces, periods of relative peace, negotiations that led nowhere. But the fundamental conflict remained unresolved. Which kingdom would dominate? Could Lower Myanmar remain independent, or would it be reabsorbed into a unified Burmese state centered in the interior? The war was brutal and exhausting for both sides. Armies marched and countermarched. Cities were besieged. Countryside was devastated. Resources that might have gone to building temples or supporting scholarship went instead to feeding soldiers and building fortifications. Neither side achieved decisive victory. When Razadarit died in 1421, his kingdom remained independent and strong. When the 40 Years' War finally ended through mutual exhaustion a few years later, the result was essentially a stalemate. But the war's most lasting effect was to entrench the division between Upper and Lower Myanmar. For another century, they would remain separate political entities with distinct identities, looking at each other across a frontier marked by mutual suspicion and periodic conflict. As the 15th century wore on, both Ava and Hanthawaddy began to show signs of strain. Ava faced continuous pressure from Shan states to its north and east. Its control over outlying regions weakened. Local governors became increasingly autonomous, acknowledging Ava's supremacy in name while acting independently in practice. The kingdom was not collapsing, but it was clearly in decline, its energy and resources slowly draining away. Hanthawaddy, too, struggled to maintain unity. The Mon regions had always been somewhat fractious, with different cities and families competing for influence. Without a leader of Razadarit's caliber to hold everything together, centrifugal forces strengthened. Into this landscape of weakening kingdoms, a new power began to emerge, not from one of the established centers, but from an unlikely place on the periphery. Toungoo was a minor state, located inland along the Sitang River, away from both the main Irrawaddy Valley and the coastal regions. It had been a backwater, a place of little apparent importance in the larger political struggles of the era. But its very marginality gave it advantages. It was far enough from Ava to avoid direct interference, yet close enough to trade routes to benefit from commerce. It could expand into thinly populated frontier regions without immediately threatening established powers. And in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, it was fortunate in its rulers. King Mingyinyo ruled Toungoo from 1486 to 1531. He was a skilled administrator and military leader who gradually built up his small state's resources and military capacity. In 1510, he formally established what would later be called the First Toungoo Dynasty, though at the time few would have predicted that this insignificant principality would soon dominate all of Myanmar. By 1531, when Mingyinyo died, Toungoo was no longer minor. It was a rising power, its armies battle-tested, its treasury full, its leadership ambitious. Mingyinyo's son and successor was named Tabinshwedi. He would rule from 1531 to 1550, and in those 19 years he would accomplish what no one had achieved since Pagan's fall 2.5 centuries earlier: the reunification of Upper and Lower Myanmar under a single crown. Tabinshwedi inherited a strong state from his father and used it brilliantly. He expanded rapidly, conquering territory, absorbing rivals, forging alliances where conquest was impractical. Ava, weakened by decades of decline, could not effectively resist. Hanthawadi, divided and exhausted, fell to Toungoo's armies. By the mid-16th century, a new Burmese empire had emerged, larger, in fact, than Pagan had ever been, and organized according to more centralized principles of administration. The long interregnum was over. The age of fragmentation had ended. Myanmar was, once again, a unified state. Looking back across those 2.5 centuries from Pagan's fall to Toungoo's rise, we might be tempted to see only chaos and decline, a golden age followed by dark centuries of division and warfare. But that would be too simple. Yes, there was fragmentation. Yes, there was almost constant conflict. But there was also extraordinary cultural activity. The regional kingdoms, Ava, Hanthawadi, Sagaing, Pinya, all sponsored literature, religious institutions, artistic production. Buddhist traditions continued to flourish, perhaps even more vigorously than before, as different kingdoms competed to demonstrate their piety and legitimacy. The Mon culture of Hanthawadi developed its own distinctive artistic and literary traditions. The Shan states of the hills created their own political and cultural forms. The mixed Shan-Burman world of Ava generated new syntheses, new ways of being Burmese that incorporated diverse influences. Diversity, in other words, was not merely a symptom of political weakness. It was also a source of cultural richness, of experimentation, of multiple centers of creativity, rather than just one. When Toungoo reunified Myanmar, it inherited not just territory, but this accumulated cultural wealth, the literature, the artistic traditions, the religious institutions that had developed in multiple centers during the centuries of division. And so the wheel turned once more. Fragmentation gave way to unity. Regional kingdoms were absorbed into a new empire. Tabinshwedi moved quickly. His armies conquered Pegu in 1539, making the wealthy Mon capital his own. He took the ancient title of King of all Burma, proclaiming that what Pagan had once achieved, Toungoo would now restore and surpass. The long interregnum was over. The scattered pieces were being gathered up, one by one, and welded into something new, not a restoration of what had been, but a transformation, a kingdom that would reach farther, govern more systematically, and project its power across a wider stage than even Pagan had imagined. From the unlikely backwater of Toungoo, a new dynasty was rising. From the unlikely backwater of Toungoo, a new dynasty was rising. Tabinshwedi had inherited a strong state from his father, Mingyinyo. Well organized, militarily capable, positioned strategically along the Sitang River. But what he would build with that inheritance exceeded anything his father could have imagined. Between 1531 and 1550, during the 19 years of his reign, Tabinshweti transformed a minor principality into an empire. He did what no one had accomplished in the 2.5 centuries since Pagan's fall. He reunified Myanmar under a single crown. His strategy was methodical. He did not attempt to conquer everything at once. Instead, he focused first on Lower Burma, the wealthy, productive delta region and coastal plains where the Mon kingdom of Hanthawaddy had ruled for centuries. Lower Burma offered everything Toungoo needed to become a true power. It had rich agricultural lands fed by monsoon rains and the distributaries of the Irrawaddy as it spread toward the sea. It had ports that connected to maritime trade networks stretching across the Bay of Bengal and beyond. And crucially, it had access to new military technologies flowing into Southeast Asia from Europe. By 1539, Tabinshwedi had conquered Pegu, the jewel of Lower Burma. The ancient Mon capital, with its temples and wealth, became his new seat of power. 2 years later, in 1541, all of Lower Burma was under his control. The entire delta, the coastal regions, the ports where foreign ships anchored and traded. And with Lower Burma came something that would transform Burmese military power: Portuguese firearms and the mercenaries who knew how to use them. The Portuguese had arrived in the Bay of Bengal in the early 16th century, seeking profit through trade and conquest. Some were merchants, some were soldiers of fortune, some were fugitives from Portuguese colonial authorities elsewhere. They brought with them matchlock muskets, cannon, and knowledge of European military tactics. Tabinshwedi and his successors eagerly hired Portuguese mercenaries and purchased their weapons. Toungoo armies began to combine traditional Burmese martial strength, disciplined infantry, war elephants, cavalry from the Shan Highlands, with European firepower and battlefield tactics. This hybrid military system proved devastatingly effective in open-field battles. Toungoo forces could deliver volleys of musket fire that broke enemy formations, then follow up with traditional shock attacks. They could deploy artillery to breach walls or defend positions. They had an edge that their rivals struggled to match. In 1550, Tabinshwedi was assassinated, murdered by his own officials in circumstances that remain murky. He had unified Burma, but his empire was still fragile, held together more by his personal authority than by established institutions. The kingdom might have collapsed then, fragmenting once again into competing regional powers. But Tabinshwedi's brother-in-law, a commander named Bagan, seized power and proved to be an even more formidable ruler. Bagan would reign for 31 years, from 1550 to 1581, and in those 3 decades he would build what was probably the largest empire in Southeast Asian history. Baenaung's ambitions extended far beyond merely holding what Tabinshweti had conquered. He envisioned an empire that would dominate all of mainland Southeast Asia, not just the Irrawaddy Valley, not just the Mon regions of the south, but the Shan states of the highlands, the Thai kingdoms to the east, the principalities that bordered India to the west. One by one, he pursued these ambitions with relentless energy. Between 1557 and 1563, he conquered the Shan states. These upland principalities, ruled by hereditary chiefs called Seofas, had long been a source of instability, raiding into the Irrawaddy Valley, asserting independence, playing different lowland kingdoms against each other. Baenaung brought them to heel. But he did not simply impose military occupation. He reorganized how these territories were governed, integrating them into a lowland-style administrative system. He reduced the power of hereditary chiefs, bringing Shan political and ritual practices under tighter royal control. He turned what had been a fractious frontier into administered provinces. Then Baenaung turned his attention to the great Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya, Siam, as it would later be known. Ayutthaya was rich, powerful, strategically positioned at the heart of the Khao Phraya River Valley. It was not a weak target, but Baenaung campaigned against it repeatedly, and in 1569, after a prolonged siege, the Thai capital fell to Toungoo forces. He also conquered Lan Na, the northern Thai kingdom centered on Chiang Mai. He extended Toungoo influence into regions bordering Manipur in the west and Laos in the east. His armies reached the borders of Arakan. Tributary missions came from distant states, acknowledging, at least nominally, Baenaung's supremacy. At its height, the Toungoo Empire exercised suzerainty from what is now Assam and Manipur in the west to the Cambodian marches in the east, from the borders of Arakan to Yunnan in the north. It was vast, perhaps too vast, as events would prove. Baenaung's court reflected the multi-ethnic reality of his empire. When Tabinshweti had moved his capital to Pegu in 1539, he had made a deliberate choice to incorporate Mon elites into his government. Mon officials were appointed to high positions in the administration and army. This was not mere tokenism. The Mon regions of Lower Burma were populous, economically productive, and crucial to the kingdom's strength. Their participation in governance was essential. The result was what historians call a Mon-Burman synthesis, a political and cultural blending where both groups held power. Both languages were used in official contexts. Both traditions influenced court ceremony and religious patronage. This synthesis gave the Toungoo court a cosmopolitan character. It was neither purely Burman nor purely Mon, but something hybrid, drawing strength from multiple traditions. In this, it differed from Pagan, which had been more clearly dominated by Burman culture and language. But for all its power and extent, the first Toungoo Empire rested on fragile foundations. Baenaung's conquests had been rapid, too rapid for effective administration to follow. In the peripheral regions, the Shan states, the Thai kingdoms, the upland areas, Toungoo control was often superficial. Local rulers might acknowledge Baenaung's supremacy, pay tribute, provide troops when demanded, but they governed their own territories according to their own customs, and their loyalty lasted only as long as Bayanang's ability to enforce it. The empire was overextended. It required constant military campaigning to maintain. It depended heavily on Bayanang's personal leadership, his reputation for invincibility, his seemingly inexhaustible energy. When he died in 1581, the system began to unravel almost immediately. Bayanang's son and successor, Nanda Bayin, inherited an empire, but not his father's military genius or political skill. Revolts erupted across the peripheral regions. Thai princes who had submitted to Bayanang now reasserted independence. Shan chiefs stopped paying tribute and resumed raiding. The empire's outer layers began peeling away. Internal problems compounded external pressures. Succession disputes fractured the Toungoo royal family. Different factions competed for power, weakening the center even as the periphery slipped away. And then came catastrophe. Around the year 1600, forces from the Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya, newly independent and seeking revenge for past humiliations, invaded Lower Burma. They reached Pegu, the great capital that Tabin Shweti had conquered and Beiyingyong had made the center of empire. The city was burned and looted. Its wealth, accumulated over decades, was carried away. Its population scattered. The Portuguese mercenaries who had given Toungoo armies their edge either fled or switched sides. The administrative apparatus of the empire collapsed. The first Toungoo Empire, which had grown with remarkable speed, disintegrated almost as quickly as it had risen. But the Toungoo dynasty itself did not end. Surviving princes regrouped in Upper Burma, far from the devastation of Pegu. They established themselves at Ava, the old capital that had been the center of Burmese power in the 15th century before Toungoo's rise. This marked the beginning of what historians call the restored Toungoo dynasty, or the Nyaungyan period, which would last from the late 1590s until 1752, roughly a century and a half. It was a different kind of kingdom from Bayanang's empire, smaller, more cautious, more inward-looking. The restored Toungoo rulers did not attempt to reconquer Siam or dominate the Shan states or project power across all of mainland Southeast Asia. Their ambitions were more modest: to control the Irrawaddy Valley, to reunify Upper and Lower Burma when possible, to maintain stability rather than pursue glory. King Anaukpetlun, who ruled from 1605 to 1628, accomplished much of this work of restoration. By 1613, he had reunified Burma, not on the scale of Bayanang's empire, but incorporating both upper and lower regions under a single authority once again. He repelled Portuguese attempts to establish colonial control over coastal regions, maintaining Burma's independence at a time when much of maritime Southeast Asia was falling under European domination. The restored Toungoo dynasty stabilized. It sponsored Buddhist institutions, maintained trade, administered justice, kept the peace, the ordinary work of kingdoms everywhere. Life returned to rhythms disrupted by the chaos of empire's collapse. But it was always a more modest enterprise than what had come before. The memory of Bayanang's vast empire remained, both inspiration and cautionary tale. The Toungoo kings at Ava knew what ambition could achieve and what it could cost. For more than a century, the restored Toungoo dynasty endured. Kings succeeded kings, provinces were administered, monasteries were built and endowed. The Irrawaddy flowed as it always had, carrying commerce and connecting the kingdom's regions. But by the early 18th century, the dynasty's vigor was fading. Authority weakened, especially in Lower Burma. The old administrative systems functioned less efficiently. Corruption increased. Provincial governors became more autonomous, less responsive to central direction. The court at Ava seemed distant, out of touch with conditions in the south. And in Lower Burma, among the Mon population, memory stirred of earlier times, of the Hanthawadi kingdom, when Pegu had been not a provincial city, but a capital, when Mon rulers had governed their own destiny, rather than answering to Burman kings at Ava. In 1740, a Mon-led movement rose in the south with the explicit goal of restoring the Hanthawadi kingdom. It began as local resistance, scattered uprisings against Toungoo governors and tax collectors, but it grew rapidly, drawing support from Mon elites who remembered past independence, from ordinary people frustrated with distant rule, from regional leaders who saw opportunity in the dynasty's weakness. The movement succeeded beyond what anyone might have predicted. A restored Hanthawadi kingdom was proclaimed in Lower Burma. Mon forces organized and armed themselves, and they began pushing north into the Toungoo dynasty's heartland. In March of 1752, Mon forces captured Ava itself. The Toungoo royal family was destroyed, its line extinguished. The dynasty that had ruled Burma, in one form or another, for more than 2 centuries came to an end. Lower Burma had conquered Upper Burma. The Mon had overthrown the Burmans. The political order that had endured since Tabinshweti's conquests was inverted. But this Mon victory would prove short-lived. Even as Ava fell, resistance was forming in the villages of Upper Burma. A new leader was emerging, a man from an obscure background who would prove to be one of the most formidable figures in Burmese history. His name was Alangpaya, and within 2 years of Ava's fall, he would reconquer Upper Burma and found a new dynasty, the Konbaung dynasty, that would not only restore Burman rule, but would build the largest kingdom Myanmar had ever seen. The Toungoo era was ending, but what it had established, the idea of a unified Burma, the patterns of Mon-Burman cultural synthesis, the memory of empire reaching across mainland Southeast Asia, all this would shape what came next. The wheel turned once more. One dynasty fell, another rose, and in the villages and monasteries of Upper Burma, a new chapter in Myanmar's long story was beginning to unfold. In the villages of Upper Burma, far from the fallen capital at Ava, a man was gathering followers. His name was Alangpaya. He was not of royal blood. He was not a great noble or wealthy merchant. He had been a village headman in Shwebo, a small town in the dry zone north of Ava, a person of local importance, perhaps, but hardly a figure who would seem destined to found a dynasty. Yet in those dark months after Ava's fall to Mon forces in 1752, when it seemed that Upper Burma might remain permanently under southern control, Alangpaya began to organize resistance. What made people follow him? Charisma, certainly. That indefinable quality that makes some individuals natural leaders in times of crisis, military skill, demonstrated in early skirmishes against Mon forces, but also something deeper. He spoke to Burman identity, to a sense that their world had been inverted, that the natural order needed restoration. He framed his struggle in both political and religious terms. He took the title that announced his mission, Alaungpaya, the Buddha to be king, claiming Buddhist prophetic authority as well as military leadership. His resistance was not merely about driving out Mon forces, it was about restoring righteous Buddhist kingship to Burma. And his movement grew with astonishing speed. By 1754, just 2 years after Ava's fall, Alaungpayam had reconquered most of Upper Burma. Mon forces retreated southward, unable to hold territories so distant from their base in Pegu. Villages that had submitted to Mon authority now welcomed Alaungpaya as liberator. His army swelled with volunteers. Within 5 years, by 1759, he had reunified nearly all of Burma under his command. He captured Pegu itself, the ancient Mon capital. He extended control over the coastal regions. He pushed into the Shan states and borderlands. The Mon kingdom that had briefly dominated after Toungoo's fall was crushed. This was not a restoration of the Toungoo dynasty. This was something new, the Konbaung dynasty, named either after Alaungpaya himself or the village of his origin. It would be Burma's last royal dynasty, and in many ways its most formidable. Pause. The Konbaung kings built an empire that rivaled, and in some ways exceeded, anything Burma had achieved before. They expanded westward into Arakan, that coastal kingdom separated from central Burma by forested mountains. Arakan had long been independent, with its own kings and its own connections to the maritime world of the Bay of Bengal. But Konbaung armies conquered it, bringing it under Burmese sovereignty for the first time. They pushed further west still, into Manipur and even Assam, territories on the frontiers of India, far from the Irrawaddy heartland. These conquests brought Burma into direct contact with another expanding empire, the British East India Company, which was steadily consolidating control over the Indian subcontinent. To the east, Konbaung forces campaigned in Siam, Laos, and the Shan states. In 1767, a Burmese army accomplished what Bayan had done 2 centuries earlier. They sacked Ayutthaya, the Thai capital. The city was devastated so thoroughly that it was never rebuilt. The Thai kingdom relocated its capital downriver to Bangkok, and the memory of that destruction shaped Thai-Burmese relations for generations. Pause. But the Konbaung dynasty's most remarkable military achievement, or perhaps its most audacious overreach, came in the north. Between 1765 and 1769, Burma fought 4 major campaigns against the Qing dynasty of China. Not border skirmishes or raids, but full-scale military confrontations between 2 of Asia's most powerful empires. The conflicts arose from disputes over the Sino-Burmese frontier, over control of Shan states that both empires claimed, over matters of tribute and sovereignty. The Qing emperor dispatched large armies, confident in China's military superiority. But Burmese forces, fighting on familiar terrain, using guerrilla tactics in the mountains and jungles, bloodied these Chinese expeditions again and again. Neither side achieved decisive victory. The wars were costly for both empires. Eventually, pragmatism prevailed. A negotiated peace was reached that stabilized the Sino-Burmese frontier, a frontier that, with minor adjustments, has endured to the present day. For Burma, the outcome was remarkable. A relatively small Southeast Asian kingdom had fought the Qing Empire to a standstill. It was a source of immense pride, proof that Burmese military prowess could match even the most powerful neighbors. The Konbaung kings did not rule from a single fixed capital. Throughout the dynasty's history, the royal seat moved several times, sometimes for strategic reasons, sometimes for religious or astrological considerations, sometimes simply because a new king wished to establish his own capital rather than inherit his predecessors. Alaungpaya founded his capital at Shwebo, his home region. Later, kings moved to Ava, that ancient seat of Upper Burmese power, then to Amarapura, a new city built on the banks of the Irrawaddy, and finally to Mandalay, founded in 1857 by King Mindon and destined to be the last capital of independent Burma. Each move involved enormous effort and expense. The entire court relocated, officials, servants, royal regalia, administrative records. Buildings were dismantled at the old capital and reconstructed at the new. Monasteries were endowed. Walls and moats were built. Each new capital was meant to be an auspicious beginning, a physical manifestation of renewed royal authority. To modern sensibilities, this seems wasteful and inefficient, but for the Konbaung kings, the capital was not merely an administrative center, it was a sacred space, a cosmological diagram rendered in wood and brick, a place where the boundary between earthly and celestial realms grew thin. To build a new capital was to renew the cosmic order itself. The Konbaung dynasty continued and deepened administrative reforms that had begun under earlier kingdoms. The kings worked systematically to centralize control over the lowland regions, particularly the Irrawaddy Valley and the Delta. They reduced the power of hereditary local rulers, replacing them where possible with appointed governors who served at royal pleasure and could be transferred or dismissed. In the Shan states and upland regions, they curtailed the traditional autonomy of hereditary chiefs, the Sayafas, bringing them more firmly under royal authority. These chiefs were required to send their sons to the capital as hostages to ensure loyalty. They paid tribute regularly. They provided troops when demanded. The relationship became less one of alliance between equals and more one of subordination to superior power. Tax systems were reformed to increase predictable royal revenue. Commercial activities were regulated more closely. The Konbaung state was becoming more bureaucratic, more systematic, more capable of extracting resources from its territories, a necessary evolution for an empire of this size, but also one that increased friction between center and periphery. But even as the Konbaung dynasty reached its greatest extent, forces beyond its control were reshaping the region. To the west, the British Empire was steadily expanding. What had begun as a commercial enterprise run by the East India Company was transforming into territorial empire. British forces conquered one Indian kingdom after another. British administrators imposed new systems of law and taxation. British merchants sought new markets and raw materials, and Burma's westward expansion had brought it directly into contact with British-controlled territories. Border disputes arose. Incidents occurred. Raids, counter-raids, conflicts over refugees and fugitives. Each side accused the other of aggression. Each side felt its interests and dignity were at stake. Negotiations failed to resolve the underlying tensions. In 1824, these tensions exploded into war, the First Anglo-Burmese War. The war lasted until 1826 and ended disastrously for Burma. British forces, supported by modern weapons and naval power, invaded through Arakan and up the Irrawaddy. Burmese armies, brave and disciplined, but armed primarily with traditional weapons and led by commanders unfamiliar with European military tactics, suffered repeated defeats. The Treaty of Yandabo, signed in 1826, forced Burma to cede Arakan and Tenasserim, the coastal territories on Burma's western and southern periphery. These were not remote, unimportant regions. They were wealthy, populous, strategically valuable. Their loss was a humiliation and a severe blow to royal prestige and revenues. Worse, the treaty opened Burma to British commercial penetration. British merchants gained access to Burmese markets. British agents observed and reported on Burmese internal affairs. The kingdom's independence of action was constrained in ways that became increasingly apparent over the following decades. In 1852, the Second Anglo-Burmese War cost Burma even more territory. This conflict arose from commercial disputes and diplomatic incidents, the kind of minor frictions that might have been resolved through negotiation had both sides been willing. But British officials in India were eager for expansion. Burmese officials, humiliated by the previous war, were unwilling to make further concessions. War came almost inevitably. It was brief and one-sided. British forces occupied all of Lower Burma, the entire Irrawaddy Delta and coastal regions, the economic heartland of the kingdom. These territories were simply annexed to British India. Burma was truncated, reduced to the interior regions of Upper Burma, centered on Mandalay. The kingdom survived, but barely. It had lost perhaps half its territory and much of its wealth. It was surrounded on three sides by British-controlled lands. Its independence was nominal, maintained at British sufferance. King Mindon, who ruled from 1853 to 1878, understood the kingdom's precarious position with painful clarity. He was a reformer, perhaps the most capable and forward-thinking of the Konbaung kings. He attempted to modernize Burma's administration, making it more efficient and responsive. He encouraged trade, hoping economic development might strengthen the kingdom. He minted new coinage, reformed tax collection, invited foreign advisors, all efforts to build the kind of modern state that might resist British pressure. In 1857, he founded Mandalay as his new capital, constructing the city according to traditional cosmological principles, but also with an eye toward making it a center worthy of a modern kingdom. The palace he built there, with its walls and moat, its golden spires and carved teak halls, was the last great expression of traditional Burmese royal architecture. Mindon even made territorial concessions to the British in hopes of satisfying their expansionist appetite. He ceded the Karenni states, upland territories on Burma's eastern frontier. Perhaps, he calculated, giving away peripheral regions might preserve the core kingdom. But it was not enough. Nothing would ever be enough, because British policy aimed not at a stable accommodation with an independent Burma, but at complete control. When Mindon died in 1878, his son Thibaw inherited an impossible situation. Thibaw was young, inexperienced, surrounded by court factions competing for influence. He lacked his father's political skill and faced circumstances even more difficult than those Mindon had navigated. British officials were openly hostile, looking for pretexts to complete what earlier wars had begun. The pretext came in 1885. A commercial dispute over timber rights and a diplomatic incident involving an Italian envoy gave the British the excuse they needed. In October of that year, British forces invaded Upper Burma in what became known as the Third Anglo-Burmese War. It was barely a war at all, more an invasion, a military occupation. Burmese forces, poorly equipped and inadequately led, could offer only token resistance. Within weeks, British troops reached Mandalay. On November 28, 1885, King Thibaw was forced to abdicate. He and his queen and their children were arrested and sent into exile in India, where they would live out their remaining years far from their homeland, royal prisoners of an empire that had no further use for Burmese kings. On January 1st, 1886, Upper Burma was formally annexed to British India. The Konbaung dynasty was over. The line of Burmese kings stretching back through the Toungoo dynasty and Ava and Pagan to the earliest kingdoms of the Irrawaddy Valley, that unbroken succession of Buddhist monarchs who had ruled for more than a millennium, came to an end. The last teak halls of Mandalay Palace stood empty. The lion throne, symbol of Burmese sovereignty, was claimed as a trophy. The administrative apparatus of the kingdom was dismantled and replaced with British colonial structures. Burma had become a province of British India, to be governed from distant Calcutta and ultimately from London. Its fate would now be decided not by Burmese kings and ministers, but by British colonial officials pursuing British imperial interests. Yet for all the trauma of its ending, the Konbaung dynasty had shaped what came after in profound ways. The territory it had conquered and consolidated through military campaigns, administrative reforms, and diplomatic negotiations became the basis for modern Myanmar's borders. The internal administrative divisions it created, the patterns of center-periphery relations it established, the ethnic complexities it generated through conquest and incorporation, all these would persist into the colonial period and beyond. The Konbaung kings had created not just an empire, but a political space that, even after their dynasty fell, retained a coherent identity. When independence eventually came in the 20th century, it would be this Konbaung-defined territory, with all its internal diversity and tensions, that would become the modern nation of Myanmar. The dynasty was gone, but its legacy endured, woven into the very fabric of the land and people it had ruled. And now, as the 19th century drew toward its close, Burma entered a new and profoundly different era, one shaped not by indigenous kingdoms, but by the global forces of European colonialism. The transition from kingdom to colony did not happen all at once. It came in stages across 6 decades through 3 wars that progressively stripped Burma of its sovereignty until nothing remained but memory and exile. The First Anglo-Burmese War had begun in 1824, triggered by border tensions along the frontiers where Burmese and British territories met. Burma's expansion westward into Arakan and Assam had brought it into direct contact with British-controlled India. Border raids occurred. Refugees crossed back and forth. Incidents multiplied, each side blaming the other, each side unwilling to back down. The British feared for the security of their eastern Indian territories. The Burmese court, proud and confident in its military traditions, refused to accept British demands, and so war came, perhaps inevitable, given 2 expanding empires colliding along a contested frontier. The war lasted until 1826 and revealed a harsh truth. Traditional Burmese military strength, formidable against regional rivals, could not match British industrial age warfare. British forces possessed modern artillery, muskets, and, crucially, steamships that could navigate Burma's rivers, projecting power deep into the interior in ways impossible for land armies alone. They invaded through Arakan and pushed up the Irrawaddy. Burmese forces fought bravely, but were outgunned, outmaneuvered, forced into repeated retreats. The Treaty of Yandabo, signed in 1826, imposed harsh terms. Burma ceded Arakan and Tenasserim, wealthy coastal provinces that provided significant revenues. It recognized British control over Assam and Manipur, territories Burma had only recently conquered. It paid a massive indemnity, and it accepted a British resident at the court in Ava, a diplomatic presence that would observe, report, and exert pressure on Burmese internal affairs. The war's outcome shocked the Burmese court. For centuries, Burma had been the dominant power in the region. Now it had suffered humiliating defeat and territorial losses at the hands of foreign invaders. The kingdom's prestige was damaged, its finances strained, its independence of action constrained. 26 years later, in 1852, came the Second Anglo-Burmese War. This conflict arose from commercial disputes and diplomatic friction, arguments over compensation for British merchants, incidents involving British ships and Burmese port officials, the kinds of issues that might have been resolved through negotiation, had either side been genuinely interested in peace. But British officials in India saw opportunity. Burma's lower territories, the Irrawaddy Delta and coastal regions, were enormously valuable. They produced rice in abundance. They had ports and access to maritime trade. Their annexation would enrich British India and remove a potentially troublesome independent kingdom from Britain's eastern frontier. The war was brief and one-sided. British forces occupied all of Lower Burma, and rather than negotiate a treaty, Britain simply annexed the territory. No agreement was signed. No peace was formally concluded. British authorities declared that Lower Burma was now part of British India, and Burmese protests were irrelevant. The Konbaung dynasty survived, but only as the government of Upper Burma, the interior regions around Mandalay. It had lost perhaps half its territory, much of its population, and most of its wealth. It was a truncated kingdom, surrounded by British territories, surviving at British sufferance. For 33 years, this awkward arrangement persisted. Upper Burma remained nominally independent under King Mindon and then his son Thibaw. Lower Burma was administered as part of British India. Trade continued across the border between them. Life went on, adapted to new realities. But British imperial ambitions had not been satisfied. In 1885, commercial disputes and diplomatic incidents once again provided pretexts for war. Britain was also anxious about French influence at King Thibaw's court. France was expanding its colonial holdings in Indochina, and British officials feared French-Burmese cooperation might threaten British interests. In October 1885, British forces launched what became the Third Anglo-Burmese War. It was barely a war at all. British steamships carrying troops and artillery moved up the Irrawaddy River toward Mandalay. What resistance the Burmese army could mount was swept aside with ease. Within weeks, British forces reached the capital. On November 28, 1885, King Thibaw surrendered. He had no choice. He and his family were arrested and sent into exile in India. And on January 1st, 1886, Upper Burma was formally annexed to British India. The Konbaung dynasty was over. The Kingdom of Burma ceased to exist. What had been an independent state for more than 1,000 years became a colonial province. But annexation did not mean immediate pacification. In the villages and rural areas, particularly in Upper Burma, armed resistance continued. Guerrilla fighters, bandits to British authorities, freedom fighters to themselves, attacked colonial outposts, ambushed patrols, refused to accept foreign rule. These were not organized armies, but scattered bands operating locally, led by former royal officials, monks, village headmen, or simply individuals who refused submission. They could not defeat British forces in open battle, but they could make occupation costly and dangerous. British authorities responded with harsh counterinsurgency tactics. Villages suspected of harboring resistors were burned. Collective punishments were imposed on communities where attacks occurred. Suspects were detained, interrogated, sometimes executed without trial. The suppression of resistance was brutal and methodical. Gradually, over several years, the insurgency was crushed, order was imposed. The rural population, exhausted and facing overwhelming force, submitted to the new reality. Burma was pacified, not through acceptance, but through the simple exhaustion of alternatives. Under British rule, Burma was administered as a province of British India, governed ultimately from Calcutta and London. This administrative arrangement had profound consequences. Burma was not treated as a distinct political entity with its own traditions and institutions deserving of respect. It was simply another territory to be governed according to British colonial models, its resources to be developed for imperial benefit, its people subject to policies designed in distant capitals by officials who knew little and cared less about Burmese history or culture. The British brought new systems of law and administration, new concepts of property and contract, new economic priorities, and these transformations reshaped Burmese society in ways that would persist long after independence. The colonial economy was oriented toward export, specifically toward rice. The Irrawaddy Delta, with its rich alluvial soil and abundant water, could produce rice in vast quantities. British authorities encouraged expansion of rice cultivation, seeing it as profitable export crop that would generate revenues and supply markets across the British Empire and beyond. Under the monarchy, land had been part of a complex system of royal grants, hereditary holdings, and village commons. Rights to land were embedded in social relationships between king and subject, landlord and cultivator, monastery and lay community. Land could not simply be bought and sold like a commodity, but British colonial policy introduced new concepts: private property, clear title, the ability to buy and sell land freely in markets. Land became a commodity like any other. This transformation had far-reaching effects. Moneylenders, often Indian migrants who had come to Burma seeking economic opportunity, provided credit to farmers for seeds, tools, and expenses. When harvests failed or prices dropped, farmers fell into debt. When they could not repay, their land was foreclosed. Landless cultivators and absentee landlords became increasingly common features of the rural landscape. Under British rule, Burma's population became more diverse and more divided. Large numbers of migrants arrived from India: laborers, merchants, moneylenders, professionals. They came because British colonial policy encouraged free movement within the empire, and Burma offered economic opportunities. Chinese migrants also arrived, particularly in the cities and commercial sectors. By the early 20th century, Rangoon, Burma's largest city and colonial capital, had become majority Indian and Chinese in population. British, Indian, and Chinese merchants dominated urban commerce. Banking, shipping, rice milling, import-export trade, all these crucial sectors were controlled primarily by non-Burmese. To ordinary Burmese, it seemed their own country had been taken over, not just politically, but economically. They worked the land, but foreigners owned the mills and controlled the markets. They lived in cities where they were minorities. Their traditional elites, the royal court, the old nobility, had been destroyed or marginalized, replaced by colonial administrators and foreign merchants. These social and economic changes generated resentment, frustration, and eventually organized resistance. In the early 20th century, new forms of Burmese nationalism began to emerge. Educated Burmese elites, many trained in British schools and familiar with Western political ideas, began articulating critiques of colonial rule. They framed colonialism not merely as foreign political domination, but as economic exploitation. They pointed to rural indebtedness, to the loss of land to foreign moneylenders, to the domination of key economic sectors by British, Indian, and Chinese interests. They argued that colonialism had impoverished Burma, even as it made the country appear prosperous in British economic statistics. Buddhist monks who maintained enormous moral authority among the Burmese population became particularly important in nationalist movements. They organized associations, published journals, led demonstrations. They linked political independence to the preservation of Burmese culture and Buddhist religion, both of which, they argued, were under threat from colonial rule and foreign immigration. Student organizations formed. Workers organized strikes. Urban intellectuals published nationalist newspapers and pamphlets. A distinct Burmese nationalist consciousness was taking shape, one that would eventually demand independence. The colonial legal and administrative systems, even as they were resented, became deeply embedded in Burmese institutional life. British-style courts replaced traditional systems of royal justice. British concepts of law, contracts, torts, criminal procedure became the framework through which disputes were resolved. English became the language of administration and higher education. The civil service was organized according to British models, with hierarchies, examinations, standardized procedures. Christian missionary schools, particularly in areas populated by ethnic minorities, introduced Western education and helped create new identities distinct from Burman Buddhist majority culture. Karen, Kachin, and Chin communities, educated in mission schools and often recruited into colonial military and police forces, developed complex relationships with both the colonial state and the Burman nationalist movement. These divisions between majority and minority, lowland and highland, Buddhist and Christian, those who benefited from colonial connections and those who resented them, would persist into the independence era and shape Myanmar's politics for generations. The British ruled Burma for just over 60 years, from 1886 to 1948, with an interruption during Japanese occupation in World War II. 60 years is not very long in the span of a civilization's history. Many people who had lived under the last Burmese kings survived into the colonial era. Traditional social structures, cultural practices, religious institutions, all these persisted, adapted to new circumstances, but not erased. Yet those 60 years transformed Burma profoundly. The economy was restructured, social hierarchies were reordered, new identities and divisions emerged. The very concept of what Burma was, its boundaries, its internal organization, its place in a larger world, was redefined. When independence came in 1948, Burmese leaders inherited this colonial legacy in all its complexity. They inherited borders drawn by British treaties and conquests. They inherited administrative systems designed for colonial governance. They inherited an economy integrated into global markets, but heavily dependent on rice exports and foreign capital. They inherited ethnic divisions that colonial policies had deepened, even if they had not created them. The debates that would dominate independent Burma, about socialism versus capitalism, about centralization versus federalism, about national identity and minority rights, all these were shaped fundamentally by the colonial experience. Leaders looked back to the pre-colonial period and saw a Burmese kingdom, independent and proud, before foreign conquest. They looked at the colonial economy and saw exploitation, foreign domination, rural impoverishment. They looked at ethnic divisions and saw colonial divide and rule tactics, even as they struggled to build a unified nation from Burma's diverse peoples. The colonial era was over, but its patterns persisted. The legal codes, the administrative structures, the economic relationships, the ethnic tensions, all these remained, embedded in Myanmar's institutional and social fabric. Burma had been transformed from kingdom to colony, and when it finally achieved independence, it would discover that transformation could not simply be reversed, that the past could not be restored, that the future would have to be built from the complex, contradictory legacy that colonialism had left behind. Leaders looked back to the pre-colonial period and saw a Burmese kingdom, independent and proud, before foreign conquest. They looked at the colonial economy and saw exploitation, foreign domination, rural impoverishment. They looked at ethnic divisions and saw colonial divide and rule tactics, even as they struggled to build a unified nation from Burma's diverse peoples. The colonial era was over, but its patterns persisted. The legal codes, the administrative structures, the economic relationships, the ethnic tensions, all these remained, embedded in Myanmar's institutional and social fabric. Burma had been transformed from kingdom to colony, but the deeper currents of its history, the Buddhist traditions that had shaped culture for more than a millennium, the agricultural rhythms of the Irrawaddy Valley, the complex relationships between center and periphery, the memories of independent kingdoms, none of these had been erased. They had persisted, sometimes hidden beneath colonial institutions, sometimes adapted to new circumstances, but always present, waiting to reassert themselves when the opportunity came. And that opportunity was approaching. The Second World War would shake the British Empire to its foundations. Nationalist movements across Asia would gain strength and momentum, and Burma, like so many colonized peoples, would finally achieve the independence it had sought for generations. But independence would bring its own challenges, its own complexities. The question of what Burma would become, how it would define itself, how it would govern, how it would reconcile the many threads of its past with the demands of its present, that question remained open, waiting to be answered. And that opportunity came. On January 4th, 1948, Burma became an independent republic. The British flag was lowered. The new flag of the Union of Burma was raised. Aung San's anti-fascist People's Freedom League, the political coalition that had negotiated independence, took power as the government of a sovereign nation. It had been a long struggle. The nationalist movement had built momentum through the 1920s and 1930s, drawing strength from many sources. Peasant revolts like the Saya San Rebellion of 1930 to 1932, urban labor strikes, student activism, Buddhist organizations that linked resistance to colonial rule with defense of traditional culture and religion. The Second World War had accelerated everything. Japanese occupation had temporarily displaced British rule. Burmese nationalists had first collaborated with and then turned against the Japanese. The war's end left Britain weakened, its empire crumbling, unable to resist the demands for independence that arose across Asia and Africa. And so Burma was free, at least politically free, sovereign in international law, no longer subject to decisions made in London or Calcutta. But what kind of country was this new, independent Burma? The colonial government had systematically dismantled the structures of the pre-colonial kingdom. The monarchy was gone. Its last king died in exile decades earlier. The old nobility had been stripped of power and privilege. The formal connection between state and Buddhist Sangha, that relationship of mutual support and legitimation that had defined Burmese kingdoms for centuries, had been severed. British colonial authorities had governed through secular law and bureaucratic administration, deliberately separating religion from state functions. They had treated Buddhism as a private matter, not a concern of government. The system of royal patronage that had supported monasteries and maintained the Sangha's material needs was dismantled. Yet Buddhism had not disappeared. It could not be dismantled by administrative fiat. In the villages and towns, Theravada Buddhism remained the foundation of daily life and moral understanding. Monasteries continued to function as centers of education and community gathering. Monks continued to perform their traditional roles, teaching children, providing spiritual guidance, serving as moral exemplars. Families continued to make merit through donations and religious observances. The great festivals of the Buddhist calendar, the water festival of Thingyan, the festival of lights, the beginning and end of the rain's retreat, continued to structure the rhythm of the year. Spirit worship, the veneration of nats, those beings who had been part of Burmese religious life long before Buddhism arrived, persisted alongside Buddhist practice, as it always had. Village shrines remained. Offerings were made. The boundary between Buddhist and pre-Buddhist spiritual practices remained fluid and unproblematic for most people. The Burmese language, with its Mon-derived script and its literature stretching back centuries, remained the primary language of culture and identity. Colonial rule had made English the language of administration and higher education, but it had not displaced Burmese in the hearts and homes of the people. Beneath the surface of political change, from kingdom to colony to independent republic, these deeper patterns of culture and daily life showed remarkable continuity. The forms of government changed, the laws changed, the economic systems changed, but how people understood themselves, how they marked the passage of time, how they made sense of birth and death and the texture of ordinary days, much of this remained rooted in traditions that long predated colonialism and would outlast it. This was the paradox of Burma's history: dramatic political ruptures accompanied by profound cultural continuity. Regimes rose and fell, but the village festivals continued. Kings were exiled and replaced by colonial governors who were replaced by elected politicians, but the monasteries remained, and the monks continued their daily alms rounds, and families continued to seek merit through religious giving. Yet independence brought its own challenges, complexities that would shape Burma's trajectory for decades to come. The new Union of Burma inherited deep ethnic and religious divisions. The British had governed different regions according to different systems, had recruited certain ethnic minorities preferentially, into military and administrative positions had allowed Christian missionaries extensive access to highland areas populated by non-Burman peoples. The result was a patchwork: lowland areas dominated by Burman Buddhist culture, upland regions where Karen, Kachin, Chin, and Shan peoples maintained distinct identities, often with significant Christian populations, educated in mission schools, sometimes speaking English better than Burmese. These groups had complex relationships with the independence movement. Some had fought alongside the Burmans against the British and Japanese. Others had served in British colonial forces. Some hoped for autonomy or even independence within a federal system. Others feared domination by the Burman majority. These tensions erupted almost immediately after independence. Insurgencies began. Communist insurgents, ethnic minority armed groups, various factions competing for power or autonomy or simple survival. The new government found itself fighting multiple internal conflicts, even as it tried to build a functioning state. The civilian governments of the early independence period, particularly under Prime Minister U Nu, turned to Buddhism as a source of legitimacy and unity. U Nu promoted Buddhism actively in politics. He sponsored religious ceremonies and constructions. He moved to make Buddhism the state religion, attempting to formalize what had been an informal reality, that Burma was, in the understanding of its majority population, fundamentally a Buddhist country. This was not innovation, but restoration, a return to the historical pattern where political authority and Buddhist religion mutually reinforced each other. The forms were modern: parliamentary democracy, constitutional government. But the underlying assumption was ancient. A righteous ruler supports the Dharma, and the Dharma legitimates righteous rule. But this approach alienated ethnic minorities, particularly Christians, who saw it as enshrining their second-class status. It contributed to the very divisions it was meant to overcome. In 1962, the parliamentary system ended. General Ne Win, who had led Burma's military since before independence, staged a coup and established direct military rule. He created a one-party state and announced a new ideology: the Burmese way to socialism. This ideology was a distinctive mixture: socialist economics, Burmese nationalism, and Buddhist concepts. Ne Win nationalized major industries, severely restricted foreign trade and investment, expelled many foreign residents, and turned Burma inward, cutting it off from much of the outside world. The stated goal was to protect Burma from foreign exploitation, to build a self-reliant economy based on Burmese values rather than colonial capitalism or foreign-dominated markets. In practice, the result was economic stagnation, international isolation, and the consolidation of military control over all aspects of national life. But even as Ne Win's regime broke with the parliamentary period politically and economically, it maintained and even intensified certain continuities. The military positioned itself as the guardian of Burmese identity, which it defined primarily in terms of Bamar ethnic identity and Buddhist religion. Non-Burman ethnic groups were sometimes referred to as guests, their place in the nation conditional and subordinate. Buddhism remained central to public discourse and political legitimacy. The military sponsored religious ceremonies, built pagodas, made donations to monasteries, performing the traditional roles of Buddhist rulers, even as they governed through a modern, military socialist state apparatus. Throughout these decades of political transformation, from colonial rule to parliamentary democracy to military socialism, the Sangha remained a powerful force. Monks were not merely passive recipients of state patronage. They were moral authorities, community leaders, educators, and when they felt that the government was violating Buddhist principles or harming the people, they could become voices of opposition. The Saffron Revolution of 2007 was perhaps the most dramatic example. Monks took to the streets in massive, peaceful demonstrations against military rule, their presence giving moral weight and legitimacy to popular discontent. The image of monks marching in their saffron robes, leading crowds of ordinary people, was powerful precisely because it connected to deep historical patterns. The idea that monks speak for the Dharma, that their moral authority transcends political power. The military government's violent suppression of these protests shocked many precisely because it violated traditional norms about respect for monks and religious institutions. Even authoritarian rulers were supposed to show deference to the Sangha. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, Burma, officially renamed Myanmar by the military government in 1989, though many refused to use the new name, remained a country of contradictions. It had moved from kingdom to colony, to independent republic, to military dictatorship. It had experimented with parliamentary democracy and socialist economics and various forms of military rule. Its official ideologies had shifted from Buddhist monarchy to secular colonialism, to democratic nationalism, to socialist authoritarianism. Yet beneath these surface transformations, deeper patterns persisted. Village structures that had organized rural life for centuries continued to function. Religious patronage, the giving of donations to monasteries, the sponsorship of festivals and ceremonies, remained a central way that wealthy individuals demonstrated status and accumulated merit. The ethnic diversity that characterized Burma under the Konbaung Dynasty continued to characterize Myanmar under military rule, with the same tensions between center and periphery, majority and minorities. Buddhist moral language remained the vocabulary through which most people made sense of justice, legitimacy, and proper conduct, whether they were supporting the government or opposing it, whether they identified as traditional or modern, whether they lived in villages or cities. This continuity is not simple persistence of the past. It is active, dynamic, traditions being constantly reinterpreted and deployed in new contexts, old forms filled with new meanings, historical patterns shaping contemporary choices in ways both conscious and unconscious. When modern Burmese nationalists invoke the glories of Pagan, they are not merely remembering history. They are claiming a particular vision of what Burma should be: Buddhist, proud, independent, unified under strong central authority. When ethnic minorities resist that vision, they too are drawing on historical memories of autonomy before conquest, of distinct identities and ways of life that predate incorporation into a Burman-dominated state. When monks march in protest, they embody centuries of tension and cooperation between religious and political authority. When military rulers sponsor pagoda construction, they perform rituals of Buddhist kingship, even as they govern through modern, bureaucratic, and military institutions. The past is not dead. It is not even past. It lives in the present, not as museum piece, but as active force, shaping how people understand themselves and their world. And so we return to where we began, to those ancient caves with their red ochre paintings, to the prehistoric peoples who first inhabited this land, to the long accumulation of cultures and kingdoms and empires that preceded our present moment. History is not a simple progression from past to present, from traditional to modern, from simple to complex. It is layered, recursive, full of unexpected continuities and surprising ruptures. The very old and the very new exist side by side. Ancient patterns reassert themselves in contemporary forms. What seems lost suddenly reappears, transformed but recognizable. Burma, Myanmar, carries all of its history within itself. The prehistoric cultures and Bronze Age communities, the Pew and Mon kingdoms, the glories of Pagan and the fragmentations that followed, the Toungoo and Konbaung empires, the trauma of colonialism, and the struggles of independence, all these are present still, not as relics, but as living elements of a complex, ongoing story. The temples of Bagan still stand on their dusty plain, weathered by centuries, but enduring. Pilgrims still visit them, making offerings, seeking merit, connecting themselves to traditions more than 1,000 years old. The Irrawaddy still flows from north to south, carrying life and commerce as it has since, long before recorded history began. And in villages and cities, in monasteries and markets, in the daily rhythms of work and festival and religious observance, the people of Myanmar continue the ancient work of making meaning, building community, passing on culture to the next generation, work that connects them to ancestors they will never know, extending chains of continuity that stretch back into the depths of time. This is what endures beyond kingdoms and colonies, beyond regimes and revolutions, the patient work of ordinary life, the persistence of culture, the human need to belong to something larger than oneself, whether that something is called tradition or religion or simply home. Burma became Myanmar in name. Kingdoms became colonies, became republics. Political systems rose and fell. But something deeper than politics, older than any particular form of government, continued through it all. The basic patterns of how people live together, make sense of their world, and pass on to their children the accumulated wisdom and memory of their ancestors. And so the story continues, as it has for 60,000 years and more, written not in books, but in the lives of people, in the landscape itself, in traditions that adapt and endure, in that mysterious human capacity to maintain identity and continuity, even through the most dramatic transformations. The past flows into the present will flow into the future, and somewhere, perhaps in a cave we have not yet discovered, or in a village we have not yet visited, the story of Myanmar continues to be written, one ordinary day at a time, connecting all that has been to all that is yet to come.